Okay, hello 7th grade ELA. Before we get started into our lesson today, go ahead and take a look at your activator today. Activator prompt says, this quarter while reading about Joseph Stalin and Animal Farm, we have been learning a lot about how people use power. It's important. Answer the following questions in 4 to 5 complete sentences. In order to get a 100 on your activator, I must see at least 4 complete sentences. Here's the question. Do you think people who are in positions of power and influence use their power in mostly positive or negative ways? How can people abuse their power or use it for good? So I want you to think about both of those questions. If you need a sentence starter to get started, because this is an opinion question, you could say, in my opinion, how do people use their power? Do you see examples of people using it in positive ways or negative ways? Explain in 4 to 5 complete sentences. 4 minutes is on the timer. You should have a nice big paragraph that fills up these lines, and begin. Okay, and that is time. So obviously with this activator today, there wasn't necessarily one right or wrong answer. The one thing I was looking for was that you had those 4 to 5 complete sentences and that you were actually answering the question. So you should have filled up this whole paragraph, all of these lines, and we should have been answering these 2 questions in the activator. You could have talked about a number of different things. What came to mind for me was how we see examples in the real world of people like Joseph Stalin who obviously used their power in negative ways. But we also see people who, for example, like former President Barack Obama, use their position of power and influence in mostly positive ways to try and affect change and to try to improve the environment around them. So again, no necessarily right or wrong answer. It was your opinion, but I was looking for that full paragraph. Let's get down here to today's objective. Monday and Tuesday, we spent time talking about inferences about characters, citing multiple pieces of evidence. Yesterday, we talked about objective summaries, pulling out those important details that should be included in a summary. All of those are things that you'll see on your checkpoint exam next week. But today's objective is really important. I'm excited about this lesson because it reads, I can analyze, circle that word, analyze, how the author of Animal Farm develops, circle develops, a theme throughout the text. So today we're getting to that key word theme. We actually haven't talked about themes since we read A House on Mango Street and since we did A Midwife's Apprentice. But today's lesson is going to be really important because we're really getting towards what did George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm, why did he write the book? What message is he trying to convey to us? We know a lot about Joseph Stalin. We know a lot about the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. But what message is he trying to convey or to tell us through these characters? Let's do some quick guided notes before we get into our lesson. So these you should already know, but we're going to go ahead and fill it in. Theme is the life lesson or moral, just review, that the author is trying to teach us. So in Animal Farm, there are definitely some themes about power and how people use power that the author is trying to teach us. Specifically, I want you to think about 2 things as we're going through the lesson in the independent practice today. An author can develop a theme through a character's actions that cause conflict or a problem. So today you'll be looking at certain characters in Animal Farm and their actions and how that reveals a theme. Number 2, the second thing I want you to be thinking about. I want you to be thinking about how a character makes another character feel. In parentheses, put their effects. How one character affects another character can also help the author reveal or communicate a theme or a life lesson that they're trying to teach us. If you have your guided notes, you can go ahead and flip to the very next page. As we get into our TDQs today, I want to remind you a couple things that I'm looking for in order for your responses to be high quality. I'm looking for you to flip the question. I'm looking for you to be annotating your answer in the text. And I'm looking for this to be in a complete sentence. So for example, when I look at question number 1, that's always the first thing I do as a student. When I was a student, I would read the question and it says, what topic with the animals was discussed at the meeting? I would go ahead and just put my flipped question sentence stem. The topic that was discussed was. So now I'm ready to answer as I start reading. At this time, go ahead and take out your copy of Animal Farm, Chapter 5. We're now up to Chapter 5. And go ahead and place it in front of you where you see the word start. Now, we're not going to start at the very beginning of Chapter 5 because we want to get to the real meat of the chapter where we start to see some conflict between characters, some problems, and we start to see the author really reveal the theme. So again, while I'm reading, any annotations that I make on here, any vocabulary, please make sure you're annotating. Here's the background knowledge that you need to know as we jump into the middle of Chapter 5. There is starting to be some conflict between Snowball and Napoleon. Now remember, Napoleon represents Stalin, the leader of Russia, now that the Russian Revolution is over. And Snowball represents a man named Trotsky, who was also a leader of the communists. But we're going to start to see that these men are starting to have some conflict. They overthrow Mr. Jones, they kicked him out, they promised that life would be better for all the animals, but we're going to see whether or not it actually is. We're going to go ahead and get started right here. Follow along and mark anything that I mark on the paper. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, circle disputes. Disputes just means arguments. And circle the word windmill. Some of you might know what a windmill is, some of you might not. Back in the old days, in order to generate power, a windmill was like a tall structure. The wind would blow into it, and these big sort of pieces would move. So the animals are debating whether or not they should build a windmill. There was the question of the defense of the farm. It was fully realized that though the human beings had been defeated in the Battle of the Cowshed, that's what we read yesterday, they might make another and more determined attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighboring farms more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. Notice that conflict. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was to procure, that means to get, firearms and train themselves in the use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up rebellion among the animals on the other farms. The one argued that if rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened first to Napoleon, then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. At the last day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting, hint, hint, here's our TDQ. At the meeting on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was put to vote. I'm going to underline that because there's my answer for TDQ number 1. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say the topic that was discussed was if the animals should build a windmill. That's what they're arguing over. Napoleon says one thing, Snowball says another. They're starting to have conflict. My next question. What does Snowball's opinion? That's a typo. That should say, what is? And the next one should say, so number 2 says, what is Snowball's opinion about the windmill? Number 3 should say, how does Napoleon feel about building the windmill? So I'm going to start my TDQ. Snowball's opinion. Opinion is. So from this point forward, as you start to see answers in the text, I would just pause it, come over here, get your answer down, and then come over and resume it. I'm not going to necessarily be pausing it every time to be giving you the answers, but you can control and pause and start and stop when you see answers to the questions. I'm going to come back to my text. I'm at the bottom of page 51. When the animals had assembled, over to page 52, in the big barn, Snowball stood up, and though occasionally interrupted by bleating from the sheep, bleating just means the noise that they make when they say baa, so they're baaing. From the sheep, he set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. That means he is for building the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense, and that he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds, and seemed almost indifferent. Indifferent means like he doesn't care as to the effect he produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet and, shouting down the sheep who had begun bleating again, baa, baa, broke into a passionate appeal in favor of the windmill. That means he's for it. Until now, the animals had been about equally divided in their sympathies. Sympathies just means their feelings. The animals are divided. They don't know who to side with. But in a moment, Snowball's eloquence, that means his speech, how well he speaks, had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as it might be when sordid labor was lifted from the animals' backs. That means like undesired. Undesired labor. Labor means work. So he's saying, if we get this windmill, we're not going to have to work so hard. It's going to do all the work for us. His imagination had now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Those are tools that you could use on the farm. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, plows, harrows, rollers, and reapers and binders, all tools on the farm. Besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water, and an electric heater. Hint, hint, answers to some TDQs right there. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But just at this moment, Napoleon stood up and, casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard him utter before. At this, there was a terrible baying sound. It's the sound of dogs barking outside. And, top of page 53, 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running as only a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly, he slipped, and it seemed certain that they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaws on Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked it free just in time. Then he put on an extra spurt, and with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one had been able to imagine where these creatures came from. But the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared, or raised, privately. Though not yet fully grown, they were huge dogs, and as fierce-looking as wolves. They kept close to Napoleon. Remember, Napoleon is Stalin. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs had been used to do to Mr. Jones. At this time, if there are any TDQs that you have not answered, especially numbers 4 through 8, please take the next 2 to 3 minutes to read back through, annotate, and to begin to get your answers down. If you need to pause the video at this time, please do so. Once your TDQs are answered, we're going to go ahead and move into our skill for today. Because I remember that we said during our objective that our focus was that we were going to be looking at theme, how the author develops a theme. And I'm going to give you what a possible theme is in the text. Your goal here is to be finding the evidence to support that theme. So go ahead and flip to the next page if you are done with your TDQs and take a look at our directions for task 1. Notice that again, we're talking about how an author develops or builds a theme in the story. The directions say, read the theme below, find a piece of evidence that helps develop or build the theme, and explain. We're going to do this first one together, then you're going to do the next 3 on your own before you get to one final independent practice and then the exit ticket. Here's our theme. Ruthless and harsh leaders can control others by how they use their power. In your objective this morning and in your activator, you already looked at how leaders in real life use power. But that's our theme. Ruthless and harsh leaders can control others by how they use power. I need to find some pieces of evidence, some key sentences in the text that build this theme of how leaders, harsh leaders, can control others by how they use their power. Label that actions. For these two, I'm just looking at, are there any characters that use their power, that do actions to control others? Number 1 says, cite a piece of evidence that develops the theme through a character's actions. I'm just looking for 1 or 2 sentences that show a character's actions that help develop this theme over here. I'm going to go ahead and get down my sentence stems first so that my answers, I'm sure, are high quality. So I'm going to say, on page blank, it states, and I'm going to put my quotation marks. I'm then going to come over and copy down my sentence stem over here. This evidence, we're just explaining, develops the theme because. An excellent evidence statement will have a page number, quotations, and a sentence that shows actions. An excellent evidence statement is going to explain how this evidence develops the theme. You're going to connect it back over here to these actions. So, all right, I need to look back in the text and I need to see, are there any sentences that show how any characters were using their power, misusing their power to control others? Well, I remember that in this scene that we just saw, Napoleon was using his power to control Snowball. He didn't like that Snowball disagreed with him, so he started to call the dogs after him. I remember him. So I'm going to read sentence by sentence, and I'm going to see which one of these sentences would be my best piece of evidence to develop the theme. All right, so I'm going to read the first 3 or 4 sentences here. I'm going to put a check mark next to any sentences that could possibly be evidence, and I'm going to cross out any that probably aren't. At this, there was a terrible bang outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. That one could possibly be a good piece of evidence, but let's keep reading. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. I actually like that one even a little bit more because it shows how Napoleon's actions control Snowball. Let's keep reading 2 more sentences. In a moment, he was out the door and they were after him. That one could work. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. So already, again, I'm looking for the piece of evidence that shows a character's actions. I think the best one here that shows how a character's actions can control others, how they can use their power to control others, would be this sentence right here. So I'm going to come over back to my independent practice that we're doing guided right now. And I'm going to say, on page, that was page 53, on page 53, it states, they dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place. Make sure you're keeping up. From his place in time to escape their snapping jaws. You start with a quotation mark, make sure you end with a quotation mark. I've got my evidence. I now need to come over here, and this is a really important part, this explanation, and I want to be very clear on what I'm looking for here. It says, explain how this evidence develops the theme. For each of your explanations, you need to tell me, how does this piece of evidence help the author build the theme? Remember, our theme was over here. So I'm going to say this evidence develops the theme because, well, how does it develop the theme? Connect it back to this keyword, actions. This evidence develops the theme because Napoleon's actions help him control Snowball and abuse his power. So again, a good explanation here is going to use this sentence stem. It's going to mention something about actions, and it's going to give more detailed explanation of what the character actually did. That's what I'm looking for there. We found one piece of evidence. It's now your turn to find a second piece of evidence for this same theme. Again, it could be a similar scene from our chapter where you see it could be Napoleon, it could be another character using their power to control others. 4 minutes is going on my timer. Find your evidence in the text, another sentence that shows how a character in this chapter is controlling others through their actions, and explain. 4 minutes is going on my timer. Begin. Okay, at this time, if you need to pause the video so you can finish up task 1, that's totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and move into task 2. It's very similar for what you just did, but I want to refer you back first to your notes. We said that an author can develop a theme through a character's actions. That was task 1. And also how a character makes another character feel, or how they affect another character. This is going to be task 2. So as I come to task 2, same directions. Read the theme below, find a piece of evidence that helps develop or build that theme, and explain. Our theme over here is a little bit different. Ruthless and harsh leaders can control others through fear. That's their effect on others. So again, my theme that I'm trying to find evidence for that the author is also building, before it was how leaders can control others through their actions, ruthless and harsh leaders can control others through fear, the emotion of fear. I now need to go into the text, and I need to find a piece of evidence that develops the theme through a character's effect on others. Again, I'm going to get my sentence stems. On page blank, it states, and I'm going to put my quotation marks. I'm then going to copy down my sentence stem here. And I'm going to say, this evidence develops the theme because. So this time you're going to go into the text and you're going to find 2 key sentences that show probably how Napoleon had an effect on other characters. Where do you see 2 key sentences that show how he is controlling them through fear? You need to go back into the text, and just like we did before, you need to go sentence by sentence. There are at least 2 or 3 key sentences that I'm looking for you to find and pull out that shows how Napoleon is controlling others through fear. After you get your 2 pieces of evidence, you need to then explain. Again, I'm looking for the sentence stem. This evidence develops a theme because, and instead of tying it back to a character's actions, you're tying it back to how a character affects other characters, how another character makes them feel. So you could say this evidence develops the theme because Napoleon, whatever you might say there, go ahead and bring it down. At this time, I'm going to ask you to pause your video so that you can work through this next task. So evidence and explanation, evidence and explanation. Take the next 3 minutes. So we'll say take the next 5 minutes to work through this task. I know I said pause the video, but you'll actually see the timer going. And begin. Okay, and if you want to have a quick check for understanding, there were a couple key sentences that I was hoping that you would find that showed Napoleon's effect on others and helped develop this theme of leaders using their power to control others through fear. One of those key sentences was right here. So if you did not have this one right here, please go back and fix it. The other key sentence that I was hoping that you would find was further down here in this paragraph, where we saw that they used the words silent and terrified. Again, terrified being another synonym for that word fear. So again, if you did not find those two key pieces of evidence, at least go back and fix one of them. If you had another one and you were able to argue how that showed and developed the theme of leaders controlling others through fear, that's fine as long as you could explain. We're going to transition now into our exit ticket, and I want to highlight a couple key directions here before I release you to work through the final piece of your lesson. For the extended exit ticket, you need to be reading on pages 54 and 55. This is a piece of the text that we haven't read yet. Each of these TDQs, I'm looking for you to have them in complete sentences and flipped. So for number 1, where it says, what change does Napoleon make? Obviously you would flip it and say the change that Napoleon makes is. The most important part, so this is worth 50 points. 50 points down here is going to be for this question that says, how does the author develop a theme in chapter 5? What theme is the author developing? Flip the question. So, 2-part question here. How does the author develop the theme? Hint, look back at your notes. Through the actions of characters, through their effect on others. And what theme is the author developing? Flip the question. Answer using ACE. I gave you some key sentence stems here. The author develops the theme of blank by, on page blank it states, this quote supports my theme. You need to follow this structure in order to be successful on your exit ticket today. So at this time, go ahead and take the next 10 minutes to finish up your exit ticket. Once you are finished, please raise your hand so that I can come over and check it.